Hi, so this video is about pre-dynastic Egypt, early Egypt. So before there were kings. Now, every culture goes through four phases, four different ages. We've got the Stone Age, the Copper Age, the Bronze Age and the Iron Age. And in modern times, we've got the Steel Age. But we've also got cultural ages as well. And one of the cultures is called Paleolithic. And Paleolithic culture is virtually Stone Age everywhere. Now, Egypt's Paleolithic culture started around about 300,000 years ago. So the first human activity ever found in Egypt. And these Paleolithic people were hunter-gatherers, and they were working in clans or tribes. Now, if we have a look at the map of Egypt, 300,000 years ago, the landscape was entirely different. Where you see these oases and these big desert areas, that's all savanna waters, outpours of water. These are wetlands full of game, full of antelope and such. So these hunter-gatherers had plenty of food sources. So they'd work in small defined areas of their savannas, and they would hunt animals and collect wild foods. Now, looking at the material culture which they left behind, there have been excavations and surveys done in those desert areas now, and we found lithic stone circles or monuments of some kind. We found flints that were used for scraping, cutting, arrowheads, scrapers for processing the hides and things like that. So that's our evidence. And these clans' ensigns, these clans and tribes had ensigns to represent their group, and it could be something like a harpoon or an elephant or a mountain range, or even a lightning bolt. So they chose these things to represent their group as they were going around their defined areas. Now, eventually those savannas dried up. So we're looking at 300,000 BCE, and then around about 12,000 BCE, the savanna, well, during that period, it went from wetlands to drying up. So all these tribes gravitated towards the River Nile, the water source. And of course, as they're gravitating, all the game have been hunted away, they've disappeared. No water for living animals, they go elsewhere. Okay, and then we enter from 12,000 BCE the Neolithic phase. The Neolithic phase is the farming phase. Now this is quite exciting. So we've gone from hunter-gathering to settling down by the river and employing farming for basic survival. So let's have a look at the Neolithics. So 12,000 BCE, that's roughly the date, give or take 1,000 years after all. Now they're settling down and they're farming. Well, the land has got to be divided, and from early hieroglyphs we can see, if you can see, this grid pattern, which represents, later on it represents a nome or city. But that grid pattern is about the division of land, sharing out, so everyone has a chance to have their own plot, to do their own farming. We have to remember the source of the Nile. So the White Nile comes from the Great Lakes of Central Africa, and that's Egypt's freshwater supply all year round. The Blue Nile comes from the Ethiopian mountains, and at the beginning of sort of April in Ethiopia, maybe even earlier, sometimes in March, the snow melts, the rainfall comes down, and that huge movement of water brings down with it black mud. Now, the flood would reach its height in Egypt in June. So that's when we talk about the Great Flood, the Great Inundation. In Upper Egypt, down at Elephantine, modern day Aswan, the records show us that it could flood 10 meters over its natural boundary. By the time it got up to Lower Egypt, modern day Cairo, we're talking 4 to 6 meters of a flood bursting over the river boundary. Eventually, that flood water dissipated back into its natural boundary, and the Egyptians were left with thick piles of black mud either side of their river, and that's what they could farm with. So they had an agricultural year. As I mentioned, the flood started in June, and that was the season of Akhet, and that went on for 4 months. The next season to follow was the season of Periet, the time of sowing the seeds. And the third season was the season of Shimu, collecting the harvest, processing the food, processing all of the harvest, and preparing the land for the new flood to come at the beginning of June. So farming was highly intensive, needed lots of labour and it was a highly intensive labour industry. Obviously, from the River Nile, you've got lots of fish, you've got dangers as well, crocodiles, hippopotamuses. So going down to the river wasn't a pleasant experience. Let's go down, strip off, it's a hot day, and swim. It's a dangerous place. Could be eaten by a crocodile, attacked by hippopotamuses, which are very unpredictable creatures. There's also snakes in Egypt, insects, scorpions. So it is a highly dangerous place going down by that river. So you never went down by the river, even to collect fresh water on your own. And if you was fishing on the Nile, you go out in groups. And the pictures we have is they're going out on these skiffs made out of papyrus reeds. And they've all got spears to fend off these dangers, not to hunt them so much, but just to stay alive. So that's the River Nile. So once they've got this black mud, they got to prepare it. They've got to plough it. So if you was a guy on your own, you would have a hand tool, and you'd have to work that hand tool to plough your fields. If you was a wealthier person and you had a couple of head of cattle, you could get them to pull a plough for you. So you've got manual, and you've got ones which can be attached to animals as well. Sowing the seeds, well, Herodotus, who was a Greek visitor to Egypt thousands of years after the civilization had been successful, he commented on how the Egyptians actually farmed, and he said that once they ploughed their fields, it was just a matter of scattering the seeds on the black soil and then allowing the animals to stamp it into the ground, and hey presto, you would get the crop growing without any other sort of nurturing at all. No need to water it or that sort of thing. That was his comment. So once their crop had grown, it had to be collected. Now, we live in the 21st century and we've got machines to do that. But if you're out there cutting it, bending over, cutting, and you're gonna get a burnt back, especially in that season of Shimu when it's pretty hot. So men wore shirts. Men were mostly covered in kilts around their lower half, but when they worked, they used a shirt to keep the sun off their backs. Women had full length dresses coming right the way down to their wrists here, and they're trying to avoid getting sunburn, to keep the heat off of them. Now, where did they get that material to make those garments? Well, in Lower Egypt, the flax plant grows, and from flax you could make linen. Now, again, this is a highly intensive exercise. You've got to grow the flax plant, you've got to harvest them, you've got to separate them into strands, then they have to be woven together on the loom. That's all labor intensive. So linen is a very expensive product. Maybe a man owned a kilt and one shirt. Maybe a lady owned only 2 dresses in the whole of her life. That's how expensive linen was. So once they collected the harvest, they made bread out of the wheat. So they grew 2 crops, wheat and barley. From wheat they would make bread, and with the barley they would fill up a pot of water, put the processed barley into the pot, and then put the bread in. Now in the barley you've got sugar, in the bread you've got yeast, and you get a natural fermentation process which brews it into beer. Now beer contains alcohol. It's going to clean out your gut, and the inside is going to keep away infection, disease. They had their kids on beer from the age of 2. So we can only imagine that their children grew up very, very happy. And of course it's the cleaning properties inside as well as the nutritional value of the bread and beer. The Egyptians regarded beer as being a food source. So they didn't have the hang-ups that we have, you know, alcoholic laws and all that sort of thing. As soon as the child was 2, you got them onto the beer. And they must have been very sort of happy, smiley kids growing up, you know, after they've had their shot of beer in the morning for breakfast. They're nice and docile for most of the day. Another shot at night time for their nighttime meal, and off they went to bed nice and happy, or just fell down to sleep. That's all we can imagine what it was like being a child in ancient Egypt. A happy time, a time of beer in the morning and beer in the evening. Okay, enough of that. The sort of animals that they had, most of their cattle was located in Lower Egypt. From the pictures from tombs, you see lots of herds of cattle in Lower Egypt. That's where the marshlands are. So there's a lot of water source, grasslands, whereas the Nile Valley is very thin. It's got 2 deserts on either side. They're relying on small animals like sheep and also ducks and geese for their meat sources. In Lower Egypt, in those marshlands, you've got those papyrus reeds grown. You can make boats out of them, skiffs, baskets, bowls, and later on in their civilization, when they had a government, they learned how to make paper out of papyrus reeds. You could make lots of different sort of industries from a single papyrus reed. Now, as these villages grew into towns and eventually became districts, there had to be someone to rule them. So the early accounts are these chaps called nomarchs. So they would have been the inheritors from the chiefs of the clans, and probably going down the bloodline. It was only the fittest who could be a nomarch. The Hebsed festival was based on being fit. If you wasn't fit, the tribe would come in and club you to death. That's what happened during the Paleolithic phase. So in the Neolithic phase, when they're farmers, there had to be fit people to govern the collection of villages or towns. Now, getting back to that grid, as the River Nile is a living organic waterway, banks of the Nile could erode and boundaries could change, and there were always disputes. The problem with us humans is instead of sitting down and working out our problems, we like to pick up our axes and spears and fight each other. So these disputes led to conquests of other gnomes and expansion of influence over other gnomes. Now, what's interesting about this is the ensigns, when they were clans, hunter-gathering, actually became their deities when they became farmers. So every gnome had its own deity. Now, how did that happen? Well, let's think that you're living in a very scary time. It's unpredictable, and you want to believe that there's a protector, an invisible protector over you, watching out for you, and maybe they attached some kind of benefits to having this ensign, and then eventually over thousands of years the ensigns became their deities, their gods. What's interesting though is if one gnome conquered another, they didn't impose their deity on the conquered gnome. Every gnome kept their own deity. There was eventually two regional deities who dominated the two different landscapes of Egypt. So in Upper Egypt, it was the deity Horus, and in Lower Egypt, it was the deity of Seth. And again, every gnome kept its own deity, so they were known as the followers of Horus, the followers of Seth. So it's almost as if they had a choice that you follow us, we're not going to stamp on you, we're not going to take away your ideas of intellectual property. We're going to share, but you must follow too in order to share. That's what I think is so special about this time. So we've had the Paleolithic phase of hunting-gathering, when it was a land of savannas, and as it dried up and they came closer to the riverbank, they became Neolithic farmers, investing in the land, setting out who had what plot and that sort of thing. So the next thing, of course, is kingship, and kingship always comes. So at the end of this phase, we have two regional powers. We have Seth in the north and Horus in the south. Okay, so I hope you've enjoyed this. Watch the early dynastic video, which is coming up soon, and I'll see you very soon. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.